our guest speaker for the Spring Speaker Series. So Dr. MacLean is an instructor at KPU. She teaches intro psych, social psychology, psychology and law, as well as consumer psychology. And her academic career began at the University of Victoria, where she attained her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and afterwards completed a Master of Science in Industrial and Organizational Psychology at St. Mary's University of Halifax. And then following that, Dr. MacLean returned to Victoria to complete her PhD in experimental psychology at UVic. Her research investigates factors that affect both eyewitness recall and decision-making for critical incidents in industrial and criminal settings. Dr. MacLean's research also probes into topics including confirmation bias, tunnel vision, and investigative interviewing techniques used by law enforcement agencies. And to date, Dr. MacLean has a number of publications regarding important forensic topics, including bias in expert judgment, perceptions of credibility, and post-identification feedback. Today, Dr. MacLean will be speaking to us about how bias among experts can lead to impartiality in criminal justice system, and how the structure of the human mind can affect the judgment of honest and hardworking individuals. After the conclusion of Dr. MacLean's presentation, there will be an open Q&A period where everyone's free to ask questions. As such, we ask that you hold your questions and keep your microphones muted until the end of Dr. MacLean's presentation, unless the question is like, I don't understand what's going on right now, and you might need a clarification, then feel free. We'd prefer you to understand what's going on. Yes. Additionally, we want you to be aware that we're going to be recording this talk, and so you probably want to keep your camera off for the duration of the event. Thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the presentation. So please welcome Dr. Carla MacLean.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to share my slides here. Okay, hi, everybody. Thank you so much to the Kwantlen Psychology Society for inviting me to talk today. You guys do such terrific work, and what I think you're really kind of the lifeblood of the psychology department at the student level, and we appreciate it so much. You guys do terrific work from, your education events that you do to hopefully education events like this, if you find it educational. But ultimately, I just want to say thank you to you guys. You do such incredible stuff. And if this is your first time attending a KPS event, I really encourage you to go to their website and go check out other events and see everything else that they're doing, because they are a pretty terrific organization. So today what I'm going to be talking about is the power of context, and I'm going to look at cognitive bias in expert judgment and decision making. Now, this title was probably fairly confusing to you when I first put it out there. And really, when I wrote the title of this talk, I'd written a little blurb with it that didn't make it onto the posters. And I think it would have helped kind of clarify what I meant in terms of the power of context written in this way. So let me just try and summarize that for you. When we think about expert decision making, we often think of experts as being impartial and unbiased or objective in the way that they look at information. And what I hope you're going to glean from the material that I share in this talk is that even people who have a enormous amount of information and an incredible capacity to process that information within a specific area still have vulnerabilities in the way that they process information. Context, in particular, can be a very powerful effect on how we process information. And what the sentence that was in my little blurb was, as expert readers, you understand what that says, the power of context. Even though the letters are wrong, you still understand it. And that's because you're so good at reading that you can kind of overcome that obstacle and understand it anyways. And so this is how your brain has kind of stepped in and filled in the space in between to help you make sense of that information. And you do it automatically. So that is what we're going to be looking at today, is that those automatic, efficient processes that experts have that enable them to make quick, often good decisions, but can sometimes lead them in the opposite direction down the garden path to make a decision that's not quite as objective as we want them to be. So in constructing this talk, there's so many ways that we can talk about expert decision making, and really, people study this within medical decision making, they study this within judicial decision making. I like to look at these concepts within occupational health and safety and workplace investigation. These types of investigations happen at the same time or in parallel often when, as a police investigation, if somebody is severely injured or dies on a work site. Because all of the same principles apply to these other areas. But this talk could have kind of touched on all of those things, but instead what I've chosen to do is really hone in the forensic area. The reason for that is that there's so much material within the forensic area that I can provide you with a really good overview of this concept and all of the nuances in the concept based on that. So that's what I'm going to do. And I always like to start with a bit of a story. So let's start with a story. This is the story of William Richards. William Richards was a guy who lived in California with his wife Pam, a happily married couple. They were building their dream home on this piece of property in California up on a hillside. And while they were building it, they were living in a trailer on the property. So it was a fairly remote setting. And the power for their living establishment was through a generator that was housed outside the building. So on August 10th, 1993, William Richards was at work. Everything was normal. He was behaving normally. He left work at the typical time, and he then headed home to go see his wife, Pam. On the way home, he stopped and he got some ice because they didn't have a refrigerator. So he got an ice chest and he picked up some groceries. And when he got to the site, he realized that the generator wasn't on, which was kind of odd because he was hoping to have some power, and that was typical that he would have power at that point. So he walks out to the generator shed and he fires the thing up. And then on his way back to the trailer, he encounters his wife, Pam. And his wife, Pam, had been murdered by we don't know who. So he's distraught. He's freaking out. He decides that he needs to call the cops. So he calls them immediately. And then he calls them again another 2 more times just to try and get them to get there because they were taking a long time. About a couple hours later, some patrol cops showed up. And then about 3 a.m. in the morning is when the homicide investigators showed up. And what they decided is to postpone the rest of the investigation until 6 a.m. because it was dark. They couldn't see what was going on the property. But during that time, police dogs were moving around. Other investigators were not even investigators. Police were moving around, and the scene and the site wasn't secured. When the police were driving up to the event, they were thinking about Richards, and they openly admit that at that point he was their number one suspect because it was such a remote location, but also they've got this base rate expectation that, when someone is murdered, it's typically the person who's closest to them. So they always look at the partner, and they were looking at him. And then they show up on the scene and they believe that he was behaving erratically. So sometimes he would be very clinical and forthright with details. Sometimes he would be very emotive and kind of swing around in how he was expressing himself. And the investigators believed that that was odd behavior, even though he was in shock. Now, importantly, the police say that they didn't find any evidence of anyone else at their trailer or at the scene of the crime. Importantly, the blood spatter expert found what they believed was medium velocity impact splatter on his shoe when they brought him into the police station. There is also embedded under Pam's nails was a few hairs, 3 hairs, but also a thread from what they believed was the shirt that he was wearing that night, that they believed she got within the struggle that occurred. She was bludgeoned to death as she was trying to get back to the trailer. Someone surprised her outside. There was also a bite mark. So, this case went to trial twice and there was a hung jury. And then they were like, there's this bite mark on Pam's arm from the attack. which carries a lot of information. So what they did is they, asked a forensic odontologist to take a look at that bite mark and identify whether they thought it was a match to Richard's. And he believes that it was a match to Richard's. And then in 1997, Richards goes to trial, and all of this information is presented and put forward. And what they determine is that he did it. He killed his wife, because look at all of this really solid evidence that's been put forward. But importantly, why isn't that working? In 2016, he was exonerated for this murder. So what happened? How can we have all of this really powerful and impressive evidence, especially forensic science evidence is just so persuasive? How could all of that come, all of that momentum, and found a conviction? It's not like they were just going to court with hearsay evidence or an eyewitness. They had all of this stuff that they could rely on, but yet he didn't do the crime. So what we're going to be looking at is all of the ways that these experts that came to trial and took a look at his case could have been biased in the way that they were looking at the information. Now, his case was taken on by the California Innocence Project. But in case you're unfamiliar with Innocence projects in general, the first one was put forward by Cardozo Law School. And they really started the Innocence Project movement. In case you're interested, UBC has an Innocence Project. Osgood Law School has an Innocence Project. So these are really what these Innocence Projects do. Cardozo started theirs in 1992. Is when DNA really kind of emerged onto the scene in a big way. All of a sudden, all of these people who were sitting in prison saying, I didn't do this, had some leverage, because DNA can now be tested more effectively than they ever believed, possible. And then these guys or these women there was usually some DNA evidence within their case. So a lot of these were rape cases because there would be a rape kit. And so these Innocence projects started digging into it, testing any evidence that was still available, and then exonerating people who actually didn't do the crime. And what this data bank provides us with, which is really beautiful, is because we never know base truth when we're dealing with these kinds of applied concepts. What this provided us with was all of this information about what happened. How many of these cases had bad eyewitness testimony? How many of these cases had bad evidence, forensic evidence? What was the structure, feature, smell, taste, everything about these types of cases that can lead us to understand? So false confessions. And what they found is that 49% of the first kind of wedge of DNA exonerations from Cardozo Law School, 49% of those DNA exonerations, what they found was unvalidated and improper forensic science. And these things contributed to a wrongful conviction. And, it's kind of a twofold thing. Forensic science, I mean, gosh, it's science, right? It sounds so powerful. It's science. How can you say no to science? But the thing with forensic science is that in terms of scientific rigor behind it, DNA evidence was really the only one that was birthed out of a lab. Out of science, whereas a lot of these were birthed out of the policing community. And it's not that police can't generate good and useful tools. It's just that so much of these didn't have kind of scientific rigor underpinning them, standardization of measures, assessments of validity and reliability, these things that we really need in order to say that something's accurate and true. And so and many of them also rely on pattern matching. And when you're doing pattern matching, a visual pattern match, it's the cognitions of the expert is the thing that is making the decision. And so a pattern, depending on the quality of the evidence and so forth, we can shove these things around a little bit. There's subjectivity in these kinds of decisions. Experts agree that only 5 to 10% of a crime lab's lab work involves DNA testing. So the vast majority of what's going on in these crime labs and the forensic evidence that's being done is not DNA. It's other stuff. It's bite mark analysis, it's fingerprint analysis, it's blood splatter, it's ballistics, it's hair and fiber analysis. So these are different animals. As I said before, it involves a lot of visual pattern matching. So, bite mark, tool mark, tire mark, handwriting analysis. The opportunity for error really kind of emerged and became very public after the Brendan Mayfield case, the Madrid bombings, where the FBI made a very big mistake by identifying the wrong person for a crime on fingerprints. And up until that point, the FBI would go into court and say, we're 100% accurate. We do not make mistakes when it comes to fingerprints. We know what we're doing. But really, that revealed that there was room for error within these judgments and decisions. And so the National Academy of Science came out in 2009 stating that there's problems with standardization, reliability, accuracy, and error, and providing room for contextual bias. So our environment, motivations, all of these different things to come in and influence the decisions that we're making in these scientific fields. More recently, there was a DNA, a group of researchers sent out DNA mixture analysis to a number of different labs all around North America. And one point I want to make about DNA is that DNA is very good, especially if you're in a situation where you're doing something like a paternity test, where you're saying, is this person directly related to that person? It's a pretty clear-cut type of judgment. But when we have something like mixture analysis, right? So some poor person is maybe the victim of a gang rape, and you've got a mixture of DNA, and you now need to understand the pattern of results compared to a number of individual people. This is where DNA can even be fallible, because it can get messy and there's room for subjectivity in that. This was a mixture analysis that was sent out to 108 North American crime labs. And what they found is that 74% of those, or 74 of those, decided that someone was part of this DNA mixture who was not. So it just kind of did this, again, trying to establish some level of, how are we doing in this field, or have we cleaned ourselves up a little bit? And we see that there's still room for error. So my talk today, and I hope you've gleaned this already, is not only just an academic issue, or a theoretical issue, but this is something that happens in the real world. This is how psychology can actually affect and elicit change, because we have something to say about this. We know about cognition, we know about judgment and decision making, we know about social psychology and the pressures of our social environment. So all of these things contribute to how we can talk about this very important topic. So, and the research that's come forward thus far shows that there's some real problems, that we need to do a lot of research, and we need to really start to tighten things up. So there are real problems that have been revealed, but there's also some incredibly good news. The good news is that typically this isn't an ethical or motivational issue when it comes to forensic scientists, and that's good. It means that these people aren't willfully trying to manipulate the data or change things, but rather it's happening on an automatic, almost unconscious level. So that's a good thing, right? It's not that there's a bunch of people who have a lot of aggressive tendencies who want to make a point. It's so what that means is that people are interested and willing, and probably more interested in taking on any interventions that we might have for them that could potentially support the work that they're doing. The other good news is that there's some practical solutions, and people are working on this stuff, right? And they're being addressed, they're being implemented, but we're not there yet. This is a big problem, and we've got a number of strategies to try and address some of the issues that we see, but so many more need to be developed, and maybe that's where you guys come in. Start thinking about how we can actually start to tackle this issue holistically. But I will also talk about some of those practical solutions as well later on. The last thing I want to say is that it's a really good thing that it's not an ethical or motivational issue, but it's also a problem because if it was an ethical or motivational issue, it would be really easy just to kind of carve out the bad apples and kind of start fresh. And we could put, from my IO background, you could start to put in selection and assessment procedures to weed out people who might be duplicitous in the way that they're managing the material. But it's not that simple. So it means that this is a little bit more of a harder nut to crack than just, weeding out the people who aren't going to do a good job. So if you leave this talk now and don't have any more time for this today, I just want to give you my take-home point before we dive in really to the nitty-gritty of it, is that the minds of competent, well-intentioned experts are remarkable. They're remarkable, and I hope I'll show you how remarkable they are, but they're also fallible. That's it. That's what I'm going to talk to you about today. The other thing I want to mention is that I'm going to be having you do kind of like little activities as I'm moving forward. So you might just want to have a little pen and paper with you to write some things down. It's really hard not having any feedback from you because I don't know when the activity's been done. So I'm just going to talk and hope that you're with me. Okay, so let's dive in. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time today talking about the different types of judgments that we make, but I'm just going to give you a little taste of some of the different judgments that when we're looking at cognitive bias, we can go from a very small level to a very large level in the way that bias can influence our decision making. So let's just first talk about, an initial judgment of a stimuli, a bit of information. So this research comes from the world of forensic anthropology. Forensic anthropology is a discipline where they take components of a body, components of bone, and they make judgments about it. Was this person male or female? And what was the health of the individual? What age of the individual? Very important things like that, ethnicity kinds of judgments. And within the world of forensic anthropology, largely they get, they work with different percentages of a body, but oftentimes they're dealing with, a partial skull or a partial body. They're not dealing with a lot of material, and they have to make these types of judgments, gender being one of the most common, if not the most common judgment that they're going to be making. So in this particular study, forensic anthropologists were given a skeleton, a full skeleton, so the entire body of a person. It was a little degraded, so it wasn't pristine, but you had the full pelvic structure, everything of this individual. So that's good news. And what they wanted to know, this skeleton was of a female, by the way. And so what they wanted to determine was whether they could kind of push these judgments around of forensic anthropologists. Now, in the control condition, when they were given no contextual information, what we found is that 31% of people said it was male. So the overwhelming majority of people understood that this skeleton was of a female, but also what you see here in this number, that it wasn't crystal clear that this person was a female. And that is often where we get the most play of bias, is when we've got some level of ambiguity within the data that the person's looking at. Now, interestingly, when they provided the forensic anthropologist with a little bit of contextual information suggesting some of the things that were found in the gravesite near it, these things suggested femininity. We get, nobody is indicating that this skeleton is male, and 100% of people are saying that it's female. Then when they provided some contextual information that indicated masculinity, we see that 72% went to male. So, you've got this stimuli, we've got a little bit of contextual information, we've got professionals who are doing this for a living and do it regularly, especially something like a sex judgment. And we can get that big of play when it comes to identification of the gender of the, or not gender, sorry, the sex of the skeleton. Now, I'm going to move from kind of the initial judgment of, what's the sex, to something more global in the judgment world, which would be, the global expert opinion. What do I think occurred here? This is a paper that is really hot off the presses. It just came out last month, and it has already caused a real firestorm of controversy. The forensic pathology community is not happy with this paper. Because it indicates a level of bias within the way that they make their decisions, which they're very uncomfortable about. So this is the story. This group of researchers took all of the death certificates over a certain period of time of children who had died in Nevada. And what they did is they carved that up between Black children and white children. And the first step in this research was simply to look at the cause of death that was written on the death certificate of Black children versus white children. And what they found is that if the child was Black, they were more likely to be deemed a homicide. Their death was more likely to be deemed a homicide than if they were white. So what does that tell us? Well, I don't know. It just means that they're judging this more. Is it accurate? Perhaps, but perhaps not. Especially when we think that maybe there's stereotypes, expectations. These things can then lead into a base rate assumption. Oh, typically we see with Black children, we see this. We're more likely to see a homicide. And then that expectation, that base rate expectation, can then be a self-fulfilling prophecy where it starts to feed back into judgment and decision making. So the researchers then moved on to the next phase where they decided to experimentally manipulate it. And what they did is they gave forensic pathologists, 133 of them, and importantly, these did not know that they were part of a research study. They actually thought that they were deciding on a case. So they gave 133 of them all of the details and information about the case for them to decide on. And they did one manipulation, which was this: the color of the child and who brought the child, who chaperoned the child into the medical environment. Now, why that's important is that neither the skin color of the child nor who brings the child to the hospital should matter when you're a forensic pathologist and you're sitting there and you're looking at a body and you're trying to figure out, and you're looking at using all of your medical knowledge to understand what has occurred in trauma and what happens during trauma, like a fall versus extreme blunt force trauma. So it is irrelevant information for these pathologists. And when the child was white and brought in by a grandmother, or the child was Black and brought in by the mother's boyfriend. And this is what was found with the research. As you can see, a number of people said inconclusive. They weren't able to do it. But of those pathologists who decided to make a rendering or a judgment about how this child died, and they believed it was a real case, when the child was white, they were more likely to rule it accident. When the child was Black, they were more likely to rule it homicide. These kinds of effects we find all over the place. We find it in arson investigation, in handwriting analysis, in alert dogs, the ones who go through the airport and try and find drugs. If the handler believes that you are someone who looks like they might have drugs in their bag, the dog has been found to alert more readily to your bags. So there's something about the way the handler is holding the dog. Polygraph results, judicial decision making, fingerprint analysis. Even people believe that fingerprint analysis is so terrific, but really there's a lot of room for error there as well. And then also DNA analysis in 2011, and that was a study around contextual effects with mixture analysis. So when I talk about bias and what bias is, I'm really talking about systematic error. It's not random error. It's systematic error. There's something driving it. It's creating a systematic error in reasoning or logic that occurred as a result of the automaticity. So as we get better and better and better at things, we do things automatically without control, conscious control. So when you read, you're not really in control of that anymore. You're now expert readers, so you just do it. Just like Tiger Woods is an expert at his golf swing versus me, who would have to think about every aspect that I'm doing when I'm moving that golf club. So these things become automatic. The better we become at something, the more automatic it happens. Another important aspect is that these are based on expectations and experiences. Our world informs our the way that we interact with it, right? We have a huge amount of experience, and that experience is gold. It's absolutely, it is the bottom line, and it is the most important thing when it comes to expertise. You need a ton of experience, but it's also one of these things that makes things hardwired and automatic and out of conscious control. And when that happens, when these things happen behind the scenes and we're not aware of it, it can influence our choices and judgment without us realizing that it's influencing our choices and judgment. This is a pyramid of sources of bias, which I find very useful. I'm going to spend some time to, I do not have time to go through all of the aspects or levels of this, but it shows you all of the different ways that, biasing information can be introduced into judgment and decision making. I'm going to spend time on the bottom level, which is human cognition, really the architecture of our brain and how we think about information, and how that allows some of these other sources of what I call contextual bias to be introduced into our judgment and decision making. It can start, if you're dealing with the case at the very top, that can be data. Sometimes we can't tease the bias out of what it is that we're looking at. If you need to figure out what this woman was saying on the tape recording and she's screaming, that gives you a lot of information about the severity of the crime, which is biasing, and it's arresting, and it creates rush, and it might lead to more rapid cognitive closure, all of these things, but we can't tease that apart very well. The reference material, so if you're looking at a fingerprint, for instance, what's the print that you're comparing it to? This is the suspect's print, this is the print lifted from the plastic bag at the scene of the crime. So that's the reference material, and it can introduce bias. Contextual information, that's that irrelevant contextual information, like the black baby scenario that I just told you about. Base rate, that's also very similar. That also is introduced by that black baby scenario as well, where we're looking at, what are people's expectations because they've encountered it before, and it starts to build this base rate about what they expect. Organizational factors can be things like stress and pressure introduced by your working environment, education and training, the type of training you undergo, and have you ever been taught about cognitive bias and how to control for it? And then also personal factors. We all have differences in the way that we manage things. Some people are more comfortable with ambiguity, and some people want to shut things down fairly quickly and make decisions quite rapidly. And these things can shift how we look at information and how we explore and then dive deeply into our understanding of material. So I'm going to start here. Okay, approaching a problem. I think you are all psychology students, so you're probably very, very familiar with this. Bottom-up processing versus top-down processing. So I'll just take a second on it. Bottom-up processing being that we want to understand the stimuli that we're looking at based on the features of the stimuli. So the timbre of the sound, the feel of it, the texture, the taste, the smell. And really, bottom-up processing, the best way I can think about it is, if somebody's ever blindfolded you and put something in your mouth and you have to try and figure out what it is, you're really moving from the basic aspects of that material, of that stimuli, and trying to create an understanding of what it is that you're eating. Now, top-down processing is how we largely process our world. So we're taking all of this incredible information that we have in our mind's eye and using it to help understand and process our environment. So these are our cognitive processes, and largely they really help us out, right? We know that stick with the bristles on it when we walk into a bathroom is a toothbrush. Whether we're in Canada or we walk into a bathroom overseas somewhere and we see that thing, it's probably a toothbrush. However, these types of top-down processing actions can also result at times in flawed judgment. And we can see that in things like police shootings where, you know, they believe they've got a threatening scenario here. They're pursuing someone, that person they're seeing as a threat, and then they turn around and they've got a wallet in their hand. And in that moment, they perceive that wallet as a gun. So it's how these top-down processing actions can also distort what we're looking at times. So top-down processing allows for that effective processing of the bottom-up data that we're getting from our world. Now, here's my first little activity for you guys. I don't know how many of you have seen this before, but it's a very, very simple task, and I know that you're all totally up for it. So here it goes. All I need you to do is read that little blurb and count the F's. Just take a minute and count how many F's are there. Okay, you got it. I mean, you guys are all expert readers. You should be able to get this, no problem. Okay. So I wish I knew your answers to how many F's there are, but I have no idea what your answers are. Now, if you're like most people, you saw these 3 F's, no problem. You saw, right? But what you might be surprised to find out is that there's actually 6 F's in this little sentence, or this little, yeah, I guess it's a sentence. There's 6 of them. Most people just see 3 or they see 4. Most people actually skip over the F's in the word of. And the reason why they're skipping over those F's is because you're an expert reader. And as an expert reader, you know that those little joining words don't actually contain content. Really, not like the big words. The big words is where the meat of the sentence is. The little words don't really do much for you. But you still registered them enough to be able to read the sentence. You saw them, you processed them, but when I asked you to pull it out, you weren't able to because you skipped over them. This was your brain making a choice for you that you didn't have control of. It was automatic, it was efficient, and it usually works very well for you because when you read, it enables you to like pull in the good content, the stuff you really need to know, the meaty bits of the sentence. So we process, I hope you took from that we process information quickly and efficiently. You know this, you're psychology students. We are so good at it, but we also have really limited mental resources. We cannot attend to everything within our environment. We just can't do it. There's just way too much out there. We can't pay attention to every fluctuation in the bird song that occurs when we leave our front door, or the feeling of our socks in our shoes, or what the guy 2 tables over is saying in a conversation. There's just way too much, so we select, and we're good at it. We take in what we need, and it largely works. This kind of information selectivity, it can't be avoided. We have limited cognitive resources to process our world, and so we're very good at selecting things out. And ultimately, we don't want to avoid it because it's good and it's efficient and it leads to good decisions, and we don't get bogged down in the details. And this happens automatically and without our conscious awareness. We're not often aware of what we're filtering out and what we're pulling in. It happens without us having our hands in it and meddling with it. Now, with expertise, the more expertise we acquire, the more experience we have, the more things become automatic and unconscious. So what does it mean? That means that we are an active machine. We've always got investment in processing our environment. We're never just passively sitting back and soaking it up. Our brain's doing all sorts of incredible stuff behind the scenes and making sure that we're working effectively within our world. Our experiences and our knowledge, these things, they guide where we look, right? Because we've got all of this knowledge. We are active machines. We know that in this environment, we should be paying attention to that. If I'm driving the car, I should be looking, when I'm coming up to an intersection, I should be looking at the crosswalks. I should be making sure nobody's going to step out in front of my vehicle. I don't often think about it. I just do it because that's the way I know it, over years and years of experience in driving, that that's the best thing to do. So it guides our perceptions, what we look at, but it can also guide what we see, how we see it, and our interpretations of the stimuli that we're looking at. Now I'm going to throw a couple of 12-letter strings at you, and I really need you to memorize them. Okay? Here's your first one. Okay, so you've probably got it. Just jot it down. I'll give you a minute to, or a second to jot it down. Okay, you ready? Here's another one that I need you to remember. Okay, now I need you to jot that one down. Got it? Okay, was one string easier to recall for you? My hunch is that yes, one string was easier for you to recall, which would be the second string. And the pattern that emerges in that second string is TV channels, MTV, CNN, ABC, and Fox. So, as human beings, we are natural pattern matchers. We're always trying to do it. It's just innate in us to find pattern. And in this circumstance, it's not that you were, combing, when you looked at that, you didn't comb the recesses of your mind and go, what could that be? I wonder if it's TV channels. No, you just figured it out. And you carved it into this, right? And it probably was easier to remember as a function of it. And so this is important because it illustrates chunking. You took 12 bits of information, which was that first string that I gave you. That was just 12 bits of information. That's hard. But when you have something, those 12 bits of information, and you can package them efficiently into 4 bits of information, which is what you did, then it makes it easier. It makes it more memorable. It makes it more usable, that information and that data. You can now use it. You're like, that's this. That's CNN. And what experts do is they chunk on a very sophisticated level. They understand patterns that they see consistently and regularly within their fields of practice that we can't see as novices. So they are chunking things in really efficient and beautifully elegant ways. And what it does is it frees up cognitive resources for them so they can use that little package of information and apply it over here. So this packaging and this chunking that's occurring is automatic and it's unconscious, and they just do it. When this research really dug in pretty nicely in the early days in chess, and what they see is that grandmasters can chunk boards. They can chunk the entire picture on the board rather than, a novice who's looking at the little, where's the pawn on my board? What square is it at? So they chunk on a sophisticated level, and it imposes order on the data that they're looking at. It quickly, rapidly kind of packages things up for them, and then they can start working with that data a little bit more efficiently and easier. But what this also does is it establishes expectations and assumptions that can start early in an investigative process or in a data analysis kind of process that can be difficult to disrupt because it can gain momentum as it moves forward, because now you've got a little bit of information and that tells you, aha, because I've seen this before, I should be looking over here for information because that typically aligns with that kind of a theory. And so it can start to shape up how people attend to information and where they look for things. Now, you are an active processor of information. And if I gave you this sentence, Anne approached the bank, my assumption is that you are all thinking about Anne with a wad of cash walking up to RBC, right? And that's an assumption. I don't know how many of you are thinking about Anne in a canoe paddling up to the bank of a river, but you quickly made an assumption about what Anne was doing based on this limited information. Here's another thing. We see that upper line as longer than the lower line, right? It's a typical visual illusion. And we do this because it's about distance, and when converging lines are going in a certain direction, that's a distance cue. And so typically with something that is the same retinal image, at that distance versus closer to us, it typically is larger. So we make an assumption and we end up just seeing the material as different. We see that line as longer, even though you know that that line is not longer, right? I can do this and show you that it's exactly the same line. It still looks longer, and no matter how many times people tell us that it's the same size line, or how many times I show you it's the same size line, we see it differently. So this is how we are active processors. We package information, we make assumptions, and then we distort information to fit. Now here's another problem. I'd like you to find the face in this image. And I'll give you a minute to do it. The face is right down here. That was difficult, right? And I don't know how many of you were able to get it if you've never seen this image before, but it's a hard thing to find that face in something that is so consistent. And this illustrates a different problem. It illustrates too much material, too much information is coming at us. So we'll miss information because of our limited capacity to notice everything. Individuals can be overloaded, and we know that there's too much material in our environment, too much to process. And when you're in a forensic investigation or an expert who's dealing with a lot of material, that can be a complicated thing. And as expertise increases, people become more selective in where they attend to information. They filter out more information at an ever increasing rate and select in on those things that are truly important. So here are a couple of images from the medical domain, because I like this illustration because I think it really illustrates a point well. The one on the right is a medical student. These are medical students, and this is eye tracking. So what they're trying to do is find the tumor in someone's lungs. And as you can see, they're all over the place. They're trying to find that tumor. Now, I'm going to show you eye tracking from an expert radiologist. They go to the places where it's typically found, these tumors, and then they quickly hone in on it. It's right there. So they've only had to look in a few places because they know where these things typically are found. If it wasn't there, then maybe they would start to branch out a little bit. But as you can see, it's a very different focus of attention than those students. So we package information, we make assumptions, we distort information, and we can miss information that is there right in front of us, but we just don't see it because we're overloaded. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move from that very bottom basic level of human and cognitive factors in the brain and start just moving up a little bit. And I'm just going to hone in on a couple of aspects. Now, here's another activity that I want you to do. I want you to try and complete the following word fragments, okay? Only spend a few seconds on each one. Try and see if they come to you quite rapidly. Okay, it's kind of difficult. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a sentence, and you can read that sentence, and then I want you to think about those words again. So here's a sentence. He got his materials from the shelves. He checked them out and then left the building. Okay, now here are those word fragments again. Does anything pop out to you? Well, if you're like me, the first time I read this, all of a sudden, library and book was just immediate. I saw it in fast. It was just there, library and book. But I still didn't know what those other two were. And that was physician and chaise. And if I had given you a sentence about a psychiatrist, you would have been more quick to get the physician and chaise words. So what I kind of give you a taste of here is the power of context. Providing just a little bit of context can make us understand ambiguous information and fill in the blanks really easily and nicely. So that is the power of context. So for instance, what is this symbol? I don't know, it's some railroad tracks perhaps. But when I put it in this context, you understand what it is. You can use it as a T, you can use it as an A. So we use our context to understand the information in front of us a little bit more effectively and efficiently. So the same piece of information can get moved around and it can get pushed around to get different interpretations depending on the context that's put forward. So let's move our way down this ladder. I've started at the top now. I'm in contextual information. So this is irrelevant contextual information. This was a study. I really like this study. It's old now, but I just think it was one of the first ones that addressed these issues, and it's done well. I like it. There were 6 fingerprint analysts from the FBI, more than 35 years of experience. And what's nice about this research is that they used decisions that these analysts had made previously, and then gave it to them again to see how it was going to, their decisions were going to be affected. And what they found, so what they did is they gave them, there was 4 matches that they had made in the past, and there was 4 decisions that they said these are not a match. So that what they're doing is they're taking a print from a criminal event and they're matching it to the print of a suspect. And so what they're doing is they're looking at the swirls and the ridges and how many identification points are on there and determining whether it's a match or it's not a match. So these are all cases that they had ruled on previously and now they were working with again. But it was unbeknownst to them. They did not know that. They thought that they were just doing this in the regular course of their work. 2 of the cases from each one of the conditions was held as control just to really test reliability, test 1, test 2 reliability. The other 2 were given contextual information about it. So in that match condition, they were given information that the suspect was in custody at the time of the crime. So how could they also be at the crime scene? And in the non-match condition, what they got was that the suspect confessed in questioning. So it's contextual information. It shouldn't change whether they see a whirl or a ridge on a print and how well it matches another print, right? It shouldn't matter because it's a visual judgment that they're making. So that contextual stuff shouldn't matter. But what they found is that 4 out of the 6 analysts changed at least one of their decisions. So change that non-match to a match or change the match to a non-match. And why this is particularly important is that these were active, these were real cases. People were sent to prison on this evidence. So, you know, if we can shove around their decisions based on context, that's concerning. So irrelevant contextual information can shape our understanding of the evidence. Now, what about those organizational factors that I talked about previously? Well, this was a really lovely study that was done fairly recently. And what it demonstrated is forensic experts, so people, clinical forensic psychologists and psychiatrists who go to court and testify on the behalf of the defendant. So what they're doing is something like a risk assessment. And those people who were in the defense condition were told that, you know, their role is to help the court understand that not every sex offender is really a really high risk for reoffending, right? So they're working for the defense. By the way, these people as well believe that this was real casework, that they'd actually been hired by a defense. Alternatively, there were people who were hired by the prosecution, and what was given to them in their direction letter was something along the lines of, you know, we bring to trial, the offenders we bring to trial are really a select group of people, and the data show are more likely than other sex offenders to reoffend. Now, what was interesting about this study in particular is that they were using fairly standardized tests and protocols. They were using the Static 9-9, which is an actuarial tool, and they were using the PCLR. The psychopathy checklist, which has a little bit more subjectivity involved in it. And what they found, though, is that if people who were working for the prosecution gave higher risk scores to offenders than those people who had been hired by the defense. So this caused a big splash within the forensic psychology world, the clinical forensic psychology world, because it really called some of these decisions and judgments into question. Sometimes when you can shove it around by this my side bias or an allegiance effect is the way that it's typically talked about. The last one on this kind of pyramid of different sources of bias that I want to talk about is personal factors. So I'm going to throw a little situation at you, and I want you to make a judgment for me. So 3 men are doing time in an Israeli prison, and they recently appeared before a parole board. The 3 prisoners had completed at least 2/3 of their sentences, but the parole board granted freedom to only 1 of them. I want you to guess which person got paroled, got the go-ahead to be paroled. So the first one, case 1, was heard in the morning. An Arab Israeli serving a 30-month sentence for fraud. Case 2 was heard after lunch. A Jewish Israeli serving, or at 3 o'clock, serving a 16-month sentence for assault. And case 3 was heard at 4:25 in the afternoon. An Arab Israeli serving a 30-month sentence for fraud. So hopefully you have picked one that you think is going to be paroled, and let's see if you're right. Case number 1 was the one paroled. So why? Why that one? Maybe you've got some ideas. Maybe you're quickly writing them up in the chat section. I don't really know, but I hope you've got some ideas around it. This was a really terrific study that came out. And again, this was a study that caused a big splash in the legal decision-making community, because what they found is that people who went up before the parole board at the end of the day were much less likely to get paroled than those people who who were seen right at the beginning of the day, when really it shouldn't be that, right? It should be about the merits of the case. So what was going on there? You can see these great little graphs on that slide where the likelihood of being paroled just kind of bounced down, down, down. And then another thing that they found is that there was a bump that would occur after a meal break. So after judges got a little bit of calories, they felt good, they had their snack, they all of a sudden started giving parole again. And this has to do with decision fatigue. and just not having enough cognitive resources to deal with the decision. And when we can't recruit those resources to deal with it because we're exhausted, just like late at night and you don't feel like doing another work assignment, we stick with the status quo. And the status quo in this circumstance is no parole. Right? It doesn't mean reworking anything. It doesn't mean digging in and biting into the information and really thinking about it intensively. It means status quo, which is just let it be. Okay, so biases and judgment process. So, as good psychology students, you've all heard of the confirmation bias. So that's what all of this is kind of building to. We've seen all these sources of bias. Now let's talk about the process of how this happens. So this is more of a process-based bias. So this is where an individual's pre-existing beliefs, their expectations, their motives, that situational context, all of these things that we've been talking about within the context of that pyramid get filtered into this process of a biased decision making. What we see is that information can then move forward and affect other things. It affects the collection of information. It affects the perception of information. And then it also affects the integration of how information comes together. And confirmation bias is kind of this global thing where we can talk about, belief perseverance being a piece of it, asymmetrical skepticism being a piece of it. So it's kind of an omnibus bias, if you will. So confirmation bias, people have an expectation, and especially when a theory is developed very early on, what can happen is it can then move its way forward. We have an established understanding or theory about how something occurred. We seek information that's consistent with it, and we interpret information as consistent with it. So things that are in line with that misperception. Now, importantly, when disconfirming information is raised, that data it can be noticed, but largely it can be ignored. It can be, if it's too overwhelming, if it's a big piece of information that just cannot be ignored, people will work very hard to kind of pull it apart so that they can explain it away. Like, it's not credible. It's not a reputable piece of information. I'm going to kind of tease this thing apart and show you how unimportant it is. And then I can move on, which is alternatively, if it's something that supports your contention, you're just like, yeah, that's a good piece of information. And you're not putting a lot of effort into understanding if it's good or bad or the quality of it. You weigh disconfirming information low. So now that we've kind of gone through all of that material, I want to come back and talk to you about William Richards and how I think some of the decision making was potentially faulty within his case. How did we get to this place? Well, let's start at the beginning, and I'm going to apologize for this slide. It's kind of messy. There's a lot of words on it, but I'll take you through bullet by bullet. So the first piece of confirmation bias is that you narrow in quite early on a theory or a hypothesis as to what's gone on. And we know that those police investigators who were driving up in the car, they openly admit that they had Richards for this. They thought he was good for it. Remote location, you've got a spouse there who's often a person of interest. And this is where that base rate expectation comes in, because we typically see, the partner of the person who's deceased as a prime suspect, because they should be. They often turn out to be, involved in it in some way, shape, or form. So there was a quick narrowing in on a theory. They also started to interpret the information that they were encountering as consistent with that theory, right? They started looking at him, they're going, he's not behaving properly, he's acting erratically. And so that just reinforced their belief that he was the person who had perpetrated this. They didn't pursue all the leads that they needed to pursue. So they said that there was no evidence that there was another person on the property, but they never swabbed the bite mark for DNA. They never swabbed the paving stone that was used to bludgeon her for DNA. There was a ton of blood in the trailer, and they just believed it was Richards. They never lifted prints. They didn't test that blood. So they kind of believed that he had done it, and they just stepped to the side when it came to the more thorough police work. and then came to the conclusion that there was no evidence on the property that indicated that there was anybody else there. Now, as I had mentioned before, there was 2 hung juries in this trial, and then the forensic odontologist was brought in to analyze the bite mark. Now, in this circumstance, what you've got is, you've got the reference that the forensic odontologist is working with, which is his mouth, and then looking over at the evidence and going, yeah, I guess, that could look like that. Right? It's going in the wrong direction. You should never go from the suspect to the evidence. It should always be from the evidence to the suspect. Looking and documenting all of the features of the evidence and saying, does it fit? But then there was also this other additional motivational or allegiance component where the forensic odontologist knew that the cops were convinced that Richards had done this. And so what they did, so there was a motivational bias there, too, that could have propelled and shifted the way that they looked at the information so that they saw match. There was a bit of an ethical issue with the fiber. When Pamela's body was photographed at the scene, there was nothing under her fingernails in terms of the blue fiber. The hairs were there. But when taken to the lab, all of a sudden they found this fiber, and they think that maybe it was planted to try and secure a conviction in the case. And then again, they didn't pursue all the relevant leads. So the police officer's behavior changed as a function of believing that he was the one who perpetrated the crime. They didn't pursue all the leads that they needed to be pursuing. And as a function of the California Innocence Project came in and started doing that and found that there was lots of evidence for another person who was on the crime, or who was at the scene that day. Okay, so we're finally at the place where I can talk about what can we do about it. Now that you've got a kind of a snapshot so fast and I'm talking so rapidly, I'm sorry, I apologize, but I wanted to jam in a lot of information in this talk. What can we do about it? What can we do about this issue of cognitive bias in expert decision-making and judgment? Well, the first thing is I want you to take a look at this picture, and I want you to come up with a theory as to what you think it is. It's a monkey. What do you think? Okay, so it's a picture of a monkey that I took on a trip to Indonesia. So now you know that ambiguous piece of information is a monkey, right? I just gave you that information. Now, when you look at that picture, do you see the monkey? Probably do. And so this is a piece of it. It's demonstrating that once we're biased, once we're given information about an ambiguous piece of information, it's hard to become unbiased. It's hard to undo it because we now will see that as a monkey. So once we're contaminated by biasing information, it's very difficult to regain our level of objectivity. Now, the next thing I want to do with you, and I'm hoping that you can do this at home and just speak to your computer, I'm going to put a word on the screen, and as quickly as you can, I want you to tell me the color of the word, right? Not what the word says, but the color of the word. Was that hard? It's always so hard. The Stroop is so difficult. And the reason why I did that to you is because even though you're aware, even though you know you're not supposed to read the word, you're still doing it. So even though you're aware of it, it's hard to suppress it. And that's the same thing with cognitive bias. Even though we're aware of cognitive bias, we can't suppress it. It's going to affect our choices and our judgments. So awareness-based protocols is useful because it convinces people that it's there and it's present and they need to do something about it, but it is not a debiasing strategy. It's not an effective debiasing strategy. So I'm going to talk about 4 things that I think are the most useful to in a debiasing kind of way. The first one is talking about that awareness. So we need people to understand that they're biased. You know, the bias blind spot is what Proning came forward with and said, people are really good at identifying that other people around them are biased, but when it comes to themselves, they just don't believe it. And it really comes back to naive realism, where we tend to believe our judgments and our experiences in the world. And because of that, we have a tough time understanding that we're biased in our judgments. And then there's that great literature from Nesbitt and Wilson in 1977 that really started everything off, showing, we have very little introspective ability to go into our cognition and unearth residue of bias and really understand how we're going wrong in our thinking. We just don't have access to it. So awareness-based programs, doing training and getting awareness of this is really, really important, because if not, people will just believe, well, Tony might be biased, but I'm not. And so if everybody holds that opinion, then nobody's doing anything about it, and nobody's going to take the time and effort and to implement strategies to try and mitigate the bias, which is what we need them to do. The next thing is essentially being good researchers. I mean, as researchers, as psychologists, what we do is we understand that information can push around judgment and decision making, and it's why we are so good at blinding our participants to what we're doing, blinding researchers to the relevant research questions when they're collecting the data, if they're interacting with people. These things are really important because it can affect our data. So it's in the same way we want to blind professionals to information that could potentially bias them. If they don't need to know it, we don't want them to have it. So if that fingerprint expert really wants to know about the case and whether the guy confessed in the interrogation, he can find out about it, but not until he's finished doing his fingerprint identification task. LSU is something called linear sequential unmasking, and this is a technique that can be used when there's information that the expert needs and has to have, but and so we can't truly blind them from it, but it's going to bias them. And so what linear sequential unmasking does is it just asks for a documentation. Always document when the information came in, and keep track of it. And if there is the information that could potentially bias, it should get bumped along the information integration path a little bit, so that it's not the first piece, so it doesn't help shape up initial theories and hypotheses, but rather moves along a little bit so that other evidence can be considered before that persuasive bit. And these questions need to be asked, which is, what information do we need? When do we need it? And then again, like I said, everything should be documented along the process. And this also helps when these kinds of rigorous protocols get put into place. It helps also in the court process, because the judge, as the gatekeeper, needs to understand, is there a potential for bias within this evidence? And the only way they'll understand that is if that expert has kept detailed notes as to how they were looking at the information. Standardization. So this is infusing some level of rigor and consistency in how people do their jobs. So standard operating procedures are now, absolutely necessary when it comes to, DNA analysis, fingerprint analysis, things like that. Within occupational health and safety, it's still a little bit of the Wild West around standardization. But it provides less opportunity for bias when we have a standardized protocol, because as you can imagine, if it's just an open season, open-ended, you don't know how the people are collecting information and how they're integrating it. And, to speak to this in that Murray paper about the forensic psychiatrists and psychologists, we saw that the actuarial tool, which is the static 9.9, had less bias infused into it than something like the PCLR, which has more subjectivity. Important, though, that we want to consider is that these new types of protocols or standardization protocols can also be a new source of bias. So the APHIS system is a fingerprint documentation system where they put a print into a database, and APHIS prints out likely people, and then as the list goes down, it's like less likely, but still the analyst needs to look at the print and what APHIS has provided and see what's a good fit. But research has demonstrated that positioning on that list, ordering, can now shift whether people think it's a match or not. I also found, this is the only reference to my research in here, I also found that in a workplace investigation tool that is used internationally and widely with high reliability organizations throughout the world, that using that tool actually led investigators to allocate more cause to a person in an industrial event than not using it. And also they responded by also not seeking as much information. So their evidence collection was abridged as well as a function of using it. So in that way, it biased the process negatively. This is the last one I'll talk about, which is consider alternatives. And it's probably something that you've seen before. This is, you've been biased, you know it's there, you're exposed to bias. What can you do about it? It's more of a cognitive-based approach, where what we want to do is consider a number of different hypotheses about the event and consider how our evidence meets with those hypotheses. And this is a useful technique, absolutely. It's not, it's by no means perfect, but it is a useful technique. It's akin to something, and we see it used in professional domains. So in police investigation, they sometimes talk about the crystal ball technique, which is essentially this, which is somebody hands you a crystal ball and you look into that crystal ball and you realize that the conclusion that you've come to is completely wrong. So how can you reconfigure your evidence to come to a different conclusion? And so it's basically that. It's how can this be different, which is interesting. And then there's also something called the analysis of competing hypotheses. And this is something that's used internationally. It's used with the CIA. It's used with CSIS here in Canada. And it's a compensatory strategy, trying to be very objective and controlled in how we're assessing the information. And what it does is it asks data analysts to actually write out the different theories and hypotheses that they're considering, put with it the different bits of evidence and how consistent it is with each theory and hypothesis. Is it diagnostic of it? Does it prove it? Does it disprove it? Is it neutral? Does it not add to it? And that's important too, because sometimes we can artificially believe that a piece of information is in support of something when really, objectively, it doesn't add to the argument. Unfortunately, I'm going to say one more thing about this. Unfortunately, up until recently, it had never been tested, something like ACH, even though it was widespread in these very high reliability fields. It has recently gone through testing, and it's not as good as they would like. There's just a lot of variability in judgments and decisions by the people who are using it. So even something like ACH can really be refined, most certainly, because we're not finding great results with it either. Okay, I'm finally at my summary slide. I hope I haven't gone over an hour. What I want you to go home with is that our decisions and our choices are shaped by all these efficiencies of our cognitive system that we don't have control over, but make our life really easy and wonderful because it's the beauty of cognition. But, cognitive bias can come in and infiltrate those judgment and decision-making processes without our awareness, kind of hijack our choices. Awareness is important and it's necessary. It's a necessary countermeasure, but it's not going to be the conclusive one. It's not going to actually change this for us. We need better strategies. We need to blind people. We need to do linear sequential unmasking. We need to be encouraging them to be considering alternatives at every step of the investigative process and decision-making process. So thank you so much. I'm here for your questions. Sydney said she liked the interactive components. Did you guys do the interactive components?
Yes.
Great. Oh, good. Good. You know what happened about halfway through? I started hearing my email going bing, bing, bing. And I was like, oh, I thought perhaps I had lost you and you guys were trying to get my attention.
Oh yeah, missing the S and of. Yeah, Kayla. I did that too, and I was like, wait, there were ofs in that sentence?
Good, good. So it worked. You know, it's the most amazing thing because I can give it to when I first started using it, I remember I gave it to my son. At that point, he was just a novice reader, and I handed it to him, and he found all the F's in a second, right? Because he's not as good as we are. But you guys are so good at reading that you jump right over it.
Yeah. I almost wrote it down myself.
Really?
Yeah, I was looking at it, I go, I know it can't be just these three, I said to myself. And I was like, maybe I'll start spelling it out.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. Yeah. Good. I'm glad that that worked. I try and, I mean, it's hard doing it this way because I can't get any feedback from you guys. I always, it's so satisfying when you get people going like, oh no, I missed it. Or the context one where people get the library and book. I love seeing that. How many people got that?
I didn't get close. I was staring at it and I was trying to figure out what it was, and I was like, no, I don't.
You kind of got book. I yeah. When I put together this talk, I realized I jammed so much information into 1 hour. I hope I didn't overload you guys, and that I got nook hook. I hope I didn't overload you, and that felt like a digestible amount of material to cover. Oh, good, great. Kyla says no.
So with that, before we go on to the Q&A, so first of all, thank you, Dr. MacLean, for giving this talk. But before we get into the Q&A section, there's just a couple of little housekeeping items to go over. So we're going to put 2 links in the chat. So the first one's going to be an event survey for students to fill out to just help improve these sort of events for the future. If you want to fill that out, it'd be helpful. And the second one is going to be the credit sheet, right? So some people might have joined for extra credit if professors are offering that for attending KPS events. So if you want your extra credit, you do have to fill that out. And then so this portion of the event isn't going to be recorded. The Q&A section isn't recorded. So if you are not comfortable, or wait, is it recorded? 1 second. Oh yeah, it's also being recorded rather. Sorry, I'm a bit confuddled because I've done some other things where it's not recorded. So if you're not comfortable having your voice recorded, just ask your questions in the text box and I'll read it out for you. So the question will still be in the recording, but your voice won't be. And if you want to speak, use the raise hand function if you, like you might in class. And so I think that covers everything. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Actually, I'll start. So you mentioned earlier on about the DNA testing not being 100% accurate when they gave it to the 108 different groups. There were the 76 who had errors. And you mentioned specifically that it was DNA mixture.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what the average for making mistakes is with a single set of DNA as opposed to mixture?
Well, the short answer for that is no.
Okay.
But part of that has to do with what we know is that something like a straight DNA analysis is very simple. It's a very, very simple one. I do not know the error rate on DNA, because that's essentially what you're asking. What also compounds these things, well, no, actually, because I was going to say what compounds these things is the fact that they happen in a real world environment. So how much can we ever know exactly what occurs? But there are controlled laboratory testing that occurs, which gives us our error rates, which we would then use as part of the Mohan criteria, right, to go into court and say that this technology has this level of error. So when I'm using it within this court situation, we can rely on the fact that the error rate is incredibly low in this type of a situation. But to speak to your question directly, I do not know the difference in error rates between mixture analysis and straight DNA analysis.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so David's asking, how do you think policy can be implemented into current investigative practice? Because it seems like even when newer evidence reveals bias within expert judgment, nothing is actually done about it.
I think if we want to change the system, the way to do it is through the courts. So when people go into court and face heat in front of a judge or are deemed not reliable or not credible in that environment, it can instigate change. So either public pressure, which happens through media, can instigate change because people get embarrassed and they want to correct these wrongs, or pressure that comes through the judicial system so that we can actually start to instigate sets of policies and procedures that have to be put in place for people to make differences, make changes in the way they're doing things. When it comes to people using their own discretion to say, my organization should do this, or, us as experts should do this, there's more variability, because who wants to put time and energy and money and all of these things into a problem that you're not even convinced that you have? And so there's certain researchers on different fronts who are doing research in this field that is embarrassing to the different levels of forensic science. So like I said, that forensic pathology study, I mean, you talk about a firestorm that happened there. I mean, forensic pathologists and their organization is just furious about it, but that's going to instigate some change probably, because now they've got to clean up their image. And so that's one way to do it. You bring it out, you put it into the public, and people say, I guess we've got to look at this within our own organization, because we don't want to be raked over the coals in a public way like that. That would be incredibly embarrassing. So let's take a look at what we're doing. Like I said, the other way to do it is to get called out in court, and for people to really say, we've got a problem here. And if the judicial system is saying this isn't credible, and if that's not credible, look at all of these cases that were tried with that evidence. And how do we know that there wasn't bias introduced in these previous cases? Then all of a sudden there's pressure getting applied from different areas on those organizations to say, clean up your act, because we've got a problem and people's lives hang in the balance. So that's how I think change happens. Unfortunately, I would love to believe that sometimes people are sitting there going, you know what? I've just read this paper, I've just looked at this book, and I think that this is relevant to us. And I think we should be making changes in the correct direction to try and address it. And I think that happens occasionally. But like I said, it all takes time, and it takes resources, and it takes a number of things that organizations and agencies and disciplines are not willing just to shell out if they're not sure that they've got the problem. Plus, everybody, like I said prior to this, believes that they're not biased. So you're just like, well, it doesn't really apply to us.
Yeah. It's the sort of normal way that change gets implemented, where it's scandal a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit of scandal. Did I answer your question properly? Can I go back and look at it? It seems, how do you think policy can be implemented in current? Yeah, I think and sorry, just to really sum up, I think standard operating procedures need to be addressed more readily. And then those standard operating procedures and standardized tools need to also be vetted to ensure that they're reliable and valid and not a new source of bias. And so those are the things that I think if people are willing to make the change, we then implement the strategies, and then those strategies are tested to ensure that they're effective.
So since research has shown that we're more likely to spot cognitive bias in others, but not with ourselves, has your research in the field helped shape your way of thinking in everyday life?
Good question, Amanda. Yeah, of course. The more I read about this stuff, the more I'm just absolutely. The Dunning-Kruger effect is something I often think about when I'm like, absolutely, I believe blah, 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 blah. Where, Dunning-Kruger effect being that, when you know little about something, you can be more confident about it. And I find sometimes I can have these really strong opinions about something, and I just stop for a minute and think, how do I know that? What kind of information am I really pulling on to make that judgment? But also, I think the most powerful thing for me in studying this research is that now I find I'm constantly questioning when I have a snap judgment about something. I'm constantly questioning, where is that coming from? Is that coming from a stereotype, a preconceived idea about this person or this group, right? Am I being prejudiced? Where am I pulling that material from? And I'm sure my entire family is sick of it, because when I do it, I'm just like, I just had this thought. What do you think about this? And then I start talking about it and unpacking it, because I feel like I now always need to be unpacking my own cognitions, my own snap judgments and decisions about things. I'm trying to understand where it materialized from. And I actually don't know. I think it's useful, and I think that's helpful. I think that's a good thing to be aware of these things. But, sussing out exactly how biased I am, in what direction am I biased? Because I often pay attention to those moments when I feel like I've had an adverse reaction to something. So it cues me. But I don't, because bias can work in it's not unidirectional. It can be both. You can be moving towards the right thing, like to the correct answer, but more so than what the information should lead you to, right? And so you're still not looking at the evidence in an objective way. And I don't think I do. I don't think I often question myself when I go towards something, have a really positive experience around it, and question why it's so positive. Whereas I tend to halt myself and consider things more carefully when I go in the negative direction.
Do you think education about cognitive bias within the police force might improve some things, at least regarding their receptivity to the implementation of anti-bias policy?
Yeah, definitely. I think there needs to be widespread education. And like I said before, awareness programs isn't going to stop bias, but at least it opens up people's understanding that they can be biased. I think a false understanding at times is people believe that bias has, saying that somebody is biased has like a moral or ethical foundation to it, when, we can give lots of reasons why somebody might have a biased response to something. And so I think once we can get that message out there, that this is human cognition, it's been fed by many different things, including, the TV shows that you watch, or, just there's all sorts of things that feed our understanding, the media and how they shape up dichotomy within our society. So having a discussion about it, a fulsome discussion, and opening up people so that they understand it a little bit better, I think is the absolute necessary first step to moving into real change and getting people to understand how their biased outlook starts to change the way they make decisions, and how it's not fair or just or equitable.
You mentioned that we all have these cognitive shortcuts because it's not possible to process everything in our environment. But while it's definitely a good idea that we're always mindful about our own biases, what do you think is a good balance between checking yourself and not overwhelming yourself with constant questioning?
Well, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask, because I just told you that I constantly am looking at it. That's a good one. Let's see. Oh, I don't know. I think that's a personal question. I think you find your own balance. Um, when it comes, if it's affecting your mental health or it's affecting how you're interacting with your world, um, because we do have these cognitive shortcuts. I think also, exposing yourself to a wide variety of information and material and understanding and educating yourself about the world is also it changes our gut reactions. It changes those fast, rapid things, so that we do just inherently see things on a more balanced plane. So I think reading and educating oneself about as much as we possibly can is a good thing. And I think it's a personal thing how often you question yourself. And don't get me wrong, I don't find it, because I study cognitive bias. I enjoy it. I'm always I don't judge it when I have these responses. I'm not hard on myself about it. I'm curious about it. Why did I respond like that? And then I try and unpack it. I'm thinking it lies somewhere between being Descartes and being a rock. I pick one conspiracy theory at a time to question my sanity. Good one. Amanda was my honor student, by the way. She knows a lot about cognitive bias. If you've got questions, you should ask her too.
So you mentioned a study with the FBI fingerprint analysts who had like 20 some odd years of experience.
35 years, yeah.
35. Okay, I knew it was either 20 or 30 something. Uh, and so you mentioned how the context was affecting them, but it was also old like fingerprints that they'd analyzed. I almost wonder if, depending on where they picked those fingerprints from in their line of their experience, if it's not the context that was affecting them entirely, but also just their increased experience and like if you picked a fingerprint from their first year as a fingerprint analyst and gave it to them 35 years later, I assume that a lot of them would have changed anyways.
I think that's a wonderful point. I think that's really astute. But to address it, they had picked fingerprints that these people had analyzed within the last 6 years.
Okay, that's yeah, because I didn't know about that. So
Yeah, no, I didn't share that. So no, that's a good, but you picked out a nice methodological aspect of the study, when did they pull it from? And that's always, it's an important thing. What role does expertise play in this as well? Which is what your point is addressing. I did a study with prevention inspectors and their ability to identify hazards on a work site when they were given different types of contextual information that pushed around their judgments. And what we found and what you see in a lot of studies is that experience, when there's a lack of standardization within protocols, and at that point, by the way, with FBI fingerprinting, there was a real lack of standardization with their protocols. But when we have a real lack of standardization with protocols, we can get so much more leverage with these manipulations because subjectivity is just kind of baked into the process. Mm-hmm. And they can then just use whatever they want. But even at that point, so when you're never getting any feedback about your performance, how do you tailor it and get better and better and better? People think they are, and they probably are in certain aspects in certain ways, but I've never found that expertise has moderated my effect. Okay. That it's been useful thus far for me, but I'm also working in fields where there's not a lot of control.
It seems like that might be all of the questions. So thank everyone for coming to this event. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you very much, Dr. MacLean, for agreeing to do the talk. It's wonderful hearing about these sort of things. I think we don't hear about them enough necessarily in class. And so before everyone goes, I just want to remind you to probably want to fill out that event survey and bonus credit link. And if you, if you want to help us improve our event or get credit, which I assume you want to get credit. And so, yeah, thank you all for coming. The recording for the event will be on the KPS YouTube in a month or two, and I hope you'll have a wonderful day.
Sounds terrific. Thank you so much for your time, you guys. This is great.